Well, hello again, quilty peeps. Welcome back to my sewing room, and welcome back for block number 2 in the 5-inch hometown blocks and the 10-inch hometown blocks. Okay, so here's the 10-inch of number 2 block, which is what we'll be doing today. Okay, and here's the 5-inch ones. Can you see them, Cass, if I just do them like that? I'll just unstack them this way. And I have 12 of these finished so far because, like I told you last time, I'm going to be making a bunch of each one, so I kind of started off with 12. This is a fun, simple block, you know, to do. It's just got the checkerboard in the middle and then the strips around the outside. And so after I show you how to sew this block, then I'll talk a little bit more about my fabric prep and how I cut for a project like this. Okay, so let's put those up there. Let's put this here so we kind of have a sample to look at. And so what I need for this block in the 5-inch size for this number 2 hometown block is I need 2 1.5 by 5.5 inch strips and 2 1.5 by 3.5 inch strips, and then I need 5 1.5 inch squares for the checkerboard. And then let me pull my fabric back in here, and out of my 1.5 inch squares I just need 4 of those. So I'm just going to peel those off my stacks right there. Getting thread all over me, like every quilter, right? And let's see. I'm sewing again with Miss Dolly today. And this is going to be an easy peasy block. I'm going to put that over there more. I know I've shown you this before, but my friend Jen, she custom did this doll for me. Is that not the sweetest? Back in 2018, that's my bloom quilt, my tomato pin cushion tutorial, my sewing machine, all that. She's amazing. Okay, so I really like to keep her there as my little quilty companion, but I want you to be able to see that block. So there I am peeking up over the top. All right, so what we're gonna do with this is we're going to start by taking just three of the 1.5 inch colored squares, and we're going to join them together using the 1/4 inch seam allowance right here. Again, you can pin if you're a pinner. If you're not, just use your fingers like I do, and I just kind of use my fingers as pins as much as I possibly can because I don't want my pins distorting my little segments as I'm trying to sew them together. And this is my little bonus sewing that I've been doing. And so I'm going to grab another bonus square and run it through so that I can then cut these apart, because I'm doing just one block at a time to show you guys. Then I normally would be doing 3, 6, 4, whatever, and chain piecing them. But we're just going to do one block. It's very simple. I think those are open enough because they're just seam on seam, that I'm not going to use the roller this time around. Then I'm just going to set that on there and let that cool. And we'll just have a quick look at this. This is the 10-inch size. These are the seams pressed open. Now, the trim-it ruler sizes that we're going to be using for this is, of course, the 5.5 inch, because they finish at 5 inches. Okay, just like that, and you can see how that all lines up. This is kind of, I really need to do it flat. on a design, not on a design board, because the design board is squishy, but see, we're going to use that. But we're going to be using, last week we used the 2.5 inch size for these corner segments right here. This is the, okay, so this is part of the blocks that I'll be doing in this series. And this is the quilt that we're doing in the Hometown Sew Along. And this is where these 5-inch blocks are, right here in the quilt. But I'm taking these and making several of each ones instead of just 4. There's 10 different blocks, 4 different colors, you know, scrappy colorways in the Hometown. I'm still using Hometown, but I'm going to make way more than 4 of each so that I can make a quilt out of all these cute little 5-inch blocks for my bed. And so last week we did this 10-inch one right here. That's block number 1. Let me grab this board. And here's a bunch that I had made last time in the last video. Okay. And for block 1, and now we're adding a bunch of these block 2s. And I'm excited to be having all these little 5-inch blocks on my bed. I know I'm going to need a lot of them because they're 5-inch to make up for a king size bed, but I think that's what's going to be cute. Okay, so the next thing I do is notice how I have these 2 going the same way and this one going another way. I'm going to, this is the one in the middle that I need to add a light colored square, a background square onto the background, meaning this little row right here. Okay, so I'm just going to do that one first. And then I know these 2 remaining squares go on the other side of these. So what I'm doing obviously for this block is doing the little checkerboard center first, using an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance right here. I'm also joining 1.5 inch squares together like this and putting them in my bowl for my bonus quilt that I've been working on. So I have some pre-set up here ready to go. Otherwise, I'd just be using a scrap of fabric in between. But I've been using a scrap of fabric in between, and everybody's like, why don't you be using a block like you do for your bonus quilts? And I'm like, okay, well, I was just trying to make it faster, but that's no problem. I might as well just be sewing the bonus blocks, right? Okay, so I'm going to squish my seams together. The top thread and the bottom, you know, the bobbin and the top thread, I kind of like squished together. Or more technical term, set your seams. I think I will just roll these and make sure they're all the way open so that I can simply just put my iron on top and press. I press as much as I can without ironing. Pressing means just pressing instead of going back and forth and around. That's for clothes. You don't really need to iron quilt blocks. You need to press them. And then I'm going to put a little bit of weight on there. Make sure I'm using cool quilter's clappers so that they can be absorbing that heat. And then I'm going to go ahead and just set this up on my design board how it needs to be set up with the strips on the side. Get that ready for my center checkerboard. I might normally leave that a little bit longer. They're pretty cool. And then I'm just gonna join it like that, okay? Now I know in this series that I've shown how to do a little checkerboard with the little stripe around it in my Sew Your Stash series, but I really wanted to add it to this series that ended up being a checkerboard pillow that I made and ended up going in my Scrappiness is Happiness book. But I really wanted to show these again because I included them in my quilt And I think it's a really cute little 5-inch block. So, I'm going to run my bonus squares through. And then before I do this, I want to open up, make sure that that all lined up correctly. I'm going to set my seam real quick. I'm going to press this both at the same time, but I'm going to set my seam because it's kind of hard to set both seams first when you've opened it up. Okay, so see how I'm lining these up on the edges of the fabric? I kind of do that first because that's what's most important to me, what meets there. Now you can pin if you want. You can, just like I showed you in my last video, you can use my double pins here. And what I do is I just barely poke one on each side of the seam where it's set up. And then I can sew over those. And then when I get to the next one, I don't have to pin it. I don't have to take the time to put a bunch of pins in. I just need one. And then repin it again for the next one. And I don't want to go like this and pin all the way through and distort. I just poke it in right there. Okay. Okay, let's grab another one of these little bonus squares. And then I can set this seam. But again, I didn't open it up, but because I, pinned it and everything. Okay, so now both of those seams are set. And I'm just going to open it up. Use the end of my finger to kind of push down. Open it. And then, especially where these seams meet up in the intersection, I'm really going to roll that. Okay, so that I can just put my iron pressing down, and I usually like to keep it on for a good, I just want to make sure that heat goes all the way through all of the layers. I'm going to use a cooler one that I haven't used to make sure that that's going to absorb the maximum heat allowed. Let that sit there for a minute. Let's see, what can I show you while we're, so here's my little squares that I have set up all ready to sew together in bonus. And when I get these all pressed open, let's see, let's pull this out, sis. See, this is what it looks like when I press them open right here. Here's more to press. And I know I've showed you in the past what I'm doing, but I'll pull that back out again maybe in the next video and show you what I'm doing with that. As soon as I get enough of, I'm doing 4 patches with those. As soon as I get enough of those, the 1.5 inch, I'm doing some 2.5 inch, and then I'm putting them together in a quilt as, again, part of the Sew Your Stash series. So I'm going to be doing bonus sewing during these tutorials and trying to get that quilt done so I can have 2 quilts done by the time. Okay, so here we go. This should measure 3.5. And again, it's kind of in my hands instead of down on the board, but I can, let's do that. Why don't I learn just to bring it down here? And then you can see here that that looks really good. This is a good way to check your seam allowances, and that all lines up within those lines there. If it did not, if it was larger or smaller, you might want to check it from the back like this and make sure that these seam allowances, see how they all line up within those little line of 1/4 inch dots. This is the 1/2 inch mark, and in between the 1/2 inch there's little dots there, and you can see that seam allowance, that is a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. If it was not, if it was a bigger seam allowance and a smaller seam allowance, then you'd be able to tell by checking it with this ruler, and that would tell you if it's too large or too small. Okay, so now it doesn't, because the seams are pressed open, it doesn't really matter which way I go. These are all flat, and it's not going to make a difference you know, if I do which side, which way. Some more bonus sewing here. All these squares are just from my scrappy stash in my baskets that I've shown you before in this series. And I love taking leftover squares and making something out of them, right? That you normally might not save or keep. It just takes a minute to cut those from your leftovers. And then you can make lots of fun projects out of them, like this one that I'm talking about with my bonus. It's just using 1.5 and 2.5 inch squares, and I'm making 4 patches out of them. Okay, now I'm going to come over here, set both seams, open it up. I'm going to use the roller at the intersections first, and then kind of come out from that. This roller really helps open those seams up. If they're not opened up, you might get like little pleats in the front, and you know, you're just going to shrink up your block. Your block's going to be smaller than it's really supposed to be. Okay, I'm going to let that get saturated. Use one that's cool here, and because this is a little bit wider, I'm going to use 2. Stack those up there for weight. I always have 6 of my small clappers here, and I have larger ones over there on the other end if I need them. But when I'm using small blocks, the 6 are enough. Okay, I'm going to let that cool down before we finish this block. And here's my little, I showed you this in the last video, but here's my little stack of backgrounds that I've got, cutting from this background for, I'm going to use this as the same background that we're using for the quilt that I showed you, but I'm going to use the same background for the quilt on my bed as well. So I really love this, made from vintage patterns. You know, my mom taught me to sew, my grandma taught me to quilt, and all these kind of fabrics that I design bring back all those memories, and I really enjoy working with them. Okay, so now I've got that, and I'm just going to take my ruler and make sure it looks pretty good height-wise, and it does. It's right on, and they're right on the lines where they should be. So I'm going to go ahead and join these 2 strips together. Now, when I have just a fabric with no seams on the bottom and seams on the other side, I like to sew with the seam side up, just so that I can make sure I'm not flipping over any seams, and I'm just, you know, can keep an eye on it and make sure that they're straight up and where they need to be as I'm going. Okay, now for the other side. Right sides together. Flip it over so the seams are up. This is a block that's so simple, there's not much thinking in it, that it would be a really perfect block for bonus sewing. Making sure things are nice and smooth as I go along. Okay, over here and set these seams. See how they're kind of squishy? Not squishy yet. I want to squish them. See how they're not squishy, how it's kind of ravelly and not flat. That's normal with any sewing machine. And so I like to set my seams and squish the bobbin thread and the top thread together in that fabric. And again, using Aurifil because it's 100% cotton, because it's thin and it's strong, and it keeps my blocks, especially my small ones, very accurate. Okay, now I just have to find a little section that I can start opening. Run over those little intersections where all of those seams meet up. Okay, I'm gonna grab one from the back that I know is nice and cool. Sometimes when I'm sewing lots of blocks at the same time, I always feel my clappers to make sure that it's not, doesn't have any warmth left in it. That one has a little bit, this one does not. Okay, I'm gonna set that there. And while we're waiting for that to cool off, I'm gonna grab another. I'll put that one for there, but I'm just gonna go through these one more time. Just all the combinations. Like this one has some yellow in there, so I put outside yellow. Sometimes there's no colors at all, that you can just put two completely different colors together, and that's what's fun about this very scrappy quilt. I guess I just didn't put it on there flat. It felt not so flat, so I wanted to make sure. Some of them don't have a lot of contrast between the two colors, and some of them do. I think that's going to be really fun in the quilt. And you can see how, let me pull this one in, for instance, how fun these will look together. When I sew this quilt together, I know I'm going to have sashing between just 1.5 inch by 5.5 inch, and then I'll do some scrappy leftover squares in the cornerstones, and so that will separate the blocks. And so I do know that much about the quilt, and when I talk about the fabric, I'll tell you a little bit more. Let's see, this should be plenty of time for that to be cool. And flat. And like I said in my last video, sometimes if I feel like it's not flat enough, I'll go ahead and press it from the front like this, and because it's already kind of flat, I can iron it a little bit without feeling like I'm going to distort it, and then I can just go ahead and lay these back down here and let it cool. It's the warm side on there. But these, there's not a lot of intersections and piecing in here, so it's going to be fine. Look how cute that looks on that little bitty board. And so I've got all of these blocks now. I've got these two so far for the table runner, and I'll do the same thing for the table runner as I'm going to do for the quilt, but I'll do, this is the background, by the way, that I'm using for the table runner, this fabric from Hometown. And this is the butter-filled in daisy print. And so I'll cut a 2.5 by 10.5 inch sashing, and then I'll use scrappy 2.5 inch squares for the cornerstones. And I'm gonna do 2 rows like this for the runner on top of each other like that. So I'll just add more blocks as I go across. And that'll be really nice on my farm table. Okay, that's it. That's the block tutorial that I have down here at the machine. I'm going to meet you back over to the cutting table, and I'm going to talk about how I cut up like the fat quarters and things like that, getting ready for a quilt like this. All right, so here we are at the cutting table, and so what I did was I took a fat quarter, and I know I've shown you this before, like how I take fat quarters and I cut them into certain size strips and add them to my scrappy strip baskets. But so far I've got a fat quarter. I've done like 3 1.5 inch strips, and then I just start, here's a 3.5, and then I'm going to cut like a 2.5, and I can use any ruler. This is a 2.5 inch wide, so sometimes it's just easier to use that. So I know in this for these quilt blocks, let me pull these in. This is what I've been cutting. So see, here's my basket here. So in these quilt blocks, I need, let's see, I don't think I need these 3.5, but I've been cutting 3.5 squares just while I was cutting. I can't remember, where's those blocks? I'm like, why do I have 3.5 in there? I better look real quick. Okay. Let me grab them over here. I just want to make sure I'm not telling you wrong. Yeah, I don't need any 3.5 inch squares, but I cut some because I had some left over in the strips, and then I'll just put those in my 3.5 square bin. But I know that for all of those blocks, plus the new ones that I'm going to be doing for my quilt, for all these 5 inch blocks, I need 2.5 inch squares. I need 2.5 by 1.5 inch strips, and then I need 2 inch squares, and then I need 1.5 by 3.5 inch strips, and then a bunch of 1.5 inch squares. And so that's what I've been subcutting these into. And so even though I have these, I probably cut a couple of 3.5 inch strips. And even though so normally I just put this in my 3.5 inch strip basket, right? I just cut it up, and then I would subcut it into the sizes that I need. But because I already know the sizes that I need, then I know that I need a bunch of 3.5 by 1.5. So I can either take my 1.5 inch ruler and just start cutting them like that, or I can take my 3.5 inch square ruler to make sure I'm keeping straight like this, meaning it's lined up this way. You know, I could double this too and cut 4 at a time, but I'm just showing you, you know, how I would do that. And then I just start adding them to my basket that I just showed you. And I usually prefer to just kind of use my 1.5 when I'm doing this, and then I can just keep going down like this, and I normally would be cutting 4 at a time. Okay, so, and then if I had leftovers at the end, like when it was folded, if I could get a 3.5 inch square, I would, you know, something like that. Okay, so that's how I do with the 3.5. Then I cut 2.5, and I know that I need squares from that. I'm going to go ahead and double that up. I know I need squares from this plus 1.5 by 2.5 inch strips. So I'm just going to take my 2.5 inch square and go ahead and cut up my 2 low casts. Can they see them? Okay. So I've got 4 2.5 inch squares there. I could get, you know, another one, another set there, or I could go ahead and hold my 1.5 inch ruler up there and get some strips that way. And now that unfolds, and I can get strips 2.5 by 1.5. Okay, so then I can add those to my pile. I just kind of take one color. This was a fat quarter. I'm gonna do the 1.5 inch strips last. Any of these rulers I can use my strip ones to get a 2 inch strip, because I do know that I need 2 inch squares for the stars. And so I'm going to go ahead and double that up. And then I'll use this ruler right here and start cutting 2 inch squares, 4 at a time. You can cut 8 at a time, but I prefer to do 4. I just don't like how tall it is, and so I feel like I'm more accurate personally if I do 4. And when I'm cutting like this, so I just took a fat quarter bundle of Hometown, and when I'm cutting like this, I'll just like turn on a show or turn on my book or something like that, or watch, you know, YouTube tutorials or something like that, and I just enjoy the process of cutting, and I don't let it, you know, I don't let it get too much of a task. I can break it up. I just have things in a basket, like my stack of fabrics right here. You know, I would just work through them one at a time, 5 at a time, whatever time I have in between, until I have this basket full of all the different color choices. And so I'm pre-cut for any of these blocks. And again, the sizes are 1.5 inch squares, 1.5 by 2.5, 1.5 by 3.5 inch rectangles, and then 2 inch squares and 2.5 inch squares. Now and so I would just keep, you know, cutting these according to what I needed. So I would measure this and I'd say, okay, well, I can't get 2.5 inch strips because it's just under 5, but that means I can get one more 2.5 inch strip and one more 2 inch strip. So that's what I'm going to do right now, and then cut these into strips and squares. So typically I would do like a 2.5 inch strip and cut it all into the 2.5 by 1.5, and then the other one I would cut it all into squares. And so this one, again, I can just get more 2 inch squares out of that one, and then that's the leftover. So the 1 inch squares, the block that I just showed you today, which is number 2, I'm going to take my 5.5 inch square ruler, because I know I need two that line up to be 1.5 by 5.5. Okay, so I'm just going to do that. So this gives me enough for one block. And from each fabric, that's really all I need, because there's, you know, several fabrics in this collection. And so if I just get one outer border from the block today, number 2 of each fabric, then I'm good to go. Because I figured, so here's my 3.5, so I need 2 3.5. I figured that, so that's good for one block, so I'll probably just stack those on a separate, Cash, you want to hand me a little design board right there? Yeah, that one's fine. I'll just probably start stacking those there so that I know that's specifically for that kind of a block. Then this one I'll open up and I'll cut it. The biggest cut I can get out of this is a 1.5 by 2.5 of the sizes that I need, because I couldn't get 2 1.5 inch squares out of it. So that'll just add that to my pile. And so that's what I would do with those 1.5 inch, with one 1.5 inch strip. I would cut for the outside of block 2 that I just showed you today. And then the rest, because they're two layers, I would put them on top of each other. And I'd simply grab this, and because I've got the 2.5 inch strips taken care of, meaning the 1.5 by 2.5, and I've got the 1.5 by 3.5 with the 3.5 inch strips. So what I have left for this is just 1.5 inch squares, and I'm going to need that more of those than anything. And so I'm just going to keep, you know, lining up that ruler and just go down like this. And so I have all different sizes of rulers, and I like to use the ruler that, you know, at least one edge, meaning one measurement, meaning 1.5 this way, works. So, you know, I showed you my 2.5, I have my 3.5, you know, I've got 4.5, but I don't need any 4.5 in this one. I just have these rulers with me, but these are my squares. I can also use my rectangles that are 2.5. This one's 2.5 by 4.5, 3.5 by 6.5, and, you know, I just continue on. It's just easier for me to use the smaller rulers when I'm cutting smaller cuts like that than to use this one, which is, you know, a very common size for me to use, which is my 6.5 by 12.5 cute cuts. But, you know, I would use these to cut out the 10 inch blocks. But I just feel like I'm more accurate if I'm using smaller rulers for smaller cuts. And so I decided that I'm going to need 16 blocks in one row going twice, you know, 16 across in the setting, 16 by 16. So that means I'm going to need 256 of these blocks. And because I have 10 different blocks right now, that means I'm going to make 16 of those 10 blocks. And then I'm going to go ahead and design 6 more before the end of this series, just so that I can add. So I'm going to end up making 16 of 16 different blocks for a total of 256. And with the sashings and everything, that'll measure approximately 95 inches square. And so that's without borders. And then I can decide after I've sewn those blocks together what kind of borders I want. I can make my quilt as larger or smaller if I want, according to what borders I put on it. I may just add a wider background border, like a 6-inch background border going all the way around, or I may choose one of the prints and do a border, or, you know, anything like that, you know, works out math-wise. And so I just normally wanted to let you know that I normally would just cut my fat quarter into strips, add them to my strippy basket, and then subcut it as I go along. But because I'm doing this all out of one fabric, that's how I'm cutting these. Oh, look, I can barely get 4 2.5-inch squares out of that. That worked out great. And so I just go along and do one color at a time. And that's how I'm ending up with these blocks. And so that's number 2. Sorry while I walk away for the... So this is number 2. And let me pull in the number 1s so far. See, that's what we've got so far. And so in my next video, I'll show you 3, and then the next video 4, and we'll just continue on from there. And so I hope that's enough information for you, for those of you who are doing the Hometown Sew Along. Now you know how to make blocks 1 and 2. And for those of you who want to join me and just use your scrappy stash or Hometown or any fabric collection that you want to do, and just start cutting a bunch of these sizes out of fat quarters. And then the backgrounds, let's talk about that real quick. So here's what I've got for my backgrounds. So for my backgrounds, I've got 2.5-inch squares. I've got 2-inch squares. I've got 1.5 by 2.5. And I've got a bunch of 1.5-inch squares. And for a few of the blocks, I needed some that were 2-inch by 2.5. Okay, so you could just cut a strip or 2 of those just to get started, and that's what I plan on doing. I'm just cutting these sizes right here until they're starting to get low, and then I'll just cut another strip or 2 as I go along. Okay, and that is if you want to use all the same background. If you don't, then just use scrappy like I do often do as well, and I think you'll be prepared, and it'll be a lot of fun. And so I hope you enjoyed today's video. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and I'll chat with you later.